When it comes to a discussion on God, we have to ask what I think is a very, very interesting question, and that is, how does God work in the world? You could even talk about this in a different type of question. Towards what end is God working? Uh, in the New Testament, the writer Paul says that God is working towards good for those who love Him. In so much of Jesus's ministry, we have language of Jesus working as an ambassador of the kingdom of God, ushering in the kingdom of God. And so, several times throughout the scriptures, we have the truth that God is working in and through the created order. So, I want to try to explore a little bit of that today. And this is what is known as a doctrine of providence. Providence is really trying to ask the question, how does God work in and through the created order? So this is really the idea that God can, but not just can, does work in and through the created order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first look at what we know as the strong doctrine of providence. I'm going to then look at what we generally call the weak doctrine of providence. And then I will try to expand what we mean by the middle doctrine of providence. Now, strong, and weak by no means really implies that the strong one is like the best argument. The weak is the weakest or the worst argument. You'll see what I mean by these here in just a second. Now, I want to focus over here first that we are not talking about deism. Now remember that deism basically says that God doesn't care about the universe. That God created the world and then left, just backed away, and is not participating in what happens in the creation at all. Please understand that Christians are not deists. Now, throughout history, some of the great people of American history were deists. Some of the great authors, the great philosophers have been deists. But Christian theology does not take the deist perspective. In other words, Christians inherently believe that God is working in and through the created order. So let's try to unpack some of these. So I'm going to move me back over here since we aren't talking about deism. You need to be sure that you are remembering what these two terms mean. Omnipotence means God being all-powerful, and then omniscience means that God is all-knowing. The question that we are really trying to discuss here is, what is the relationship between the power and the knowledge of God when it comes to the events of the world, when it comes to what God is doing? Now, remember, I've told you guys the story before that I had when I was working at a church over in Dallas, a seventh grader died one Sunday afternoon. And at his funeral, the man who was eulogizing him essentially said that God, or did say that God needed Lucas in heaven more than we needed him here on earth. In other words, it was God's will, God's providence that Lucas died. And God knew that it was going to happen. So, and the question I think that the pastors at my church asked in Dallas was, is that really the case? Does God really choose who lives and who dies? So we are talking about a doctrine of providence while looking at the omnipotence of God, God's power, and then the omniscience of God, God's knowledge. When I ask a lot of students, what is it? How do they define power? Many people define power as control, the ability to control. And so that's kind of the term I'm going to pick up on here in just a second. The strong doctrine of providence essentially says that God's power predicates that he controls what happens in the universe. So what happens in the world is because of the actions of God. If somebody dies, well, that was God working towards God's own purposes. If somebody has cancer, if a nation overtakes another nation, well, maybe that was God in the strong doctrine of providence. And then also when it comes to God's knowledge, well, in the strong view that some people, not all, some people hold, then therefore God knows everything. So not only does God control everything, not only does God plan everything, well, you can see why these are connected. God also knows everything. So when I was born, did God know that I was going to marry my wife? Well, according to the strong view, yes. But not only did God know that I was going to marry my wife, God planned it, and God had it in such a way that it was bound to happen. Now, some of you might be thinking here, well, does this limit free will? Does this limit my choice in doing things? I didn't have to ask Stacy out. I could have chosen maybe to go to a different college, and I never would have met her. Likely, I would have met somebody else, and I would have married somebody else, and maybe I wouldn't even be at the school recording this lecture at this moment. So the strong doctrine of providence essentially says, well, God does everything. God controls everything. God knows everything. And this really limits free will. Uh, Now, when it's in the strongest form, you realize that not a lot of people take this view. Because a lot of Christians really want to uphold the idea that we have free will. I can freely choose to do what I want to do. One thing that I find is very interesting and somewhat amusing is how many people think that God controls who wins the Super Bowl. And then and it's even a little bit more, a higher percentage. I think it's around 40 to 50% of Christians think that God controls who becomes president of the United States. Now, that's really interesting, right? That some people really think that God controls who is going to do that, limiting the freedom of, man, the maybe 200 million voters that vote in a presidential election. So not a ton of people hold this strong view of a doctrine of providence. Now some do, but not a ton. Let me go over here to the weak doctrine. Now the weak doctrine of providence holds that God doesn't bring about events. It's not that God doesn't care. It's just that God doesn't control what happens. At the same time, God could have prevented the event. So whereas over here in the strong doctrine, God actually brings about events. Over here in the weak, God doesn't bring about events. So when it comes to God's omniscience, God's knowledge here, well, he may have known what was going to happen, but he may not have. So again, the main difference here is in the weak doctrine of providence, God doesn't bring about the event. And over here in the strong doctrine of providence, God does bring about the event. In other words, God controls what happens over here, and God doesn't control what happens over here. Now, when it comes to the strong doctrine of providence, and when it comes to the weak doctrine of providence, there's little support on both sides of those. Does it make sense? So there are a few Christians on the strongest side, and there are a few Christians on the weakest side. Most Christians deal somewhere in the middle. They fall somewhere in the middle doctrine of providence, or the middle, which we kind of call, just to coin a phrase, the middle doctrine of providence here. And notice one of the main differences here. In this middle one, God cooperates. This is the one where God cooperates with what's going on in creation. God cooperates with humanity to bring about events. So here, God's knowledge might be limited, might not be limited, we just don't know. But God's knowledge might be limited. And for some people, they say God's knowledge is limited because they are worried if God knows the future, that might mean that God plans the future. Now, what does it mean then to say that God cooperates with other agents in bringing out events? Let me try to unpack this with a couple examples, and then we'll go on. Say somebody dies at the hand of a drunk driver. Well, who is responsible for that? Now, in the strong doctrine of providence, some people, and think about this for a second, some people say that that was caused by God. If they say that that was caused by God, they are in a sense limiting the responsibility that the individual had when he or she drank too much alcohol and got behind the wheel of a car. It exonerates them from all responsibility. God did this. Now, again, I recognize, and I mean this in a very, very sensitive and caring matter, I recognize that this is what people say at funerals. Well, God did this. It was their time. Personally, I really struggle to think when my mom was diagnosed with cancer a few years ago, that God was sitting in heaven and said, I'm going to give Mrs. Parks cancer today. I'm recording this a couple of weeks before my wife is going to deliver our first baby. And God forbid, what happened if that baby died? Some people, I know they find a lot of comfort in saying, well, it was God's plan. Uh, but I would really struggle. I would really struggle theologically if I thought that God's plan was to give a little kid cancer. Um, God's plan was to give my mom cancer. So the questions that a lot of people ask whenever they're diagnosed with some sort of major medical event is, well, oh God, why did God do this? And I'm here to say that the Christian tradition, at least in the Episcopal tradition, we don't think that God is the one who causes that. Uh, so we're not talking about mundane things, and I never want to call cancer mundane. We're not talking about stuff like that. We're not talking about God, causing a drunk driver to do that. That God doesn't do that. We are really trying to unpack what does it mean to say that God cooperates with other agents to bring about the purposes that God is working towards. Okay, what does that really look like? So here, I want to try to then move and turn the corner here and try to ask the question, well, how does God work in the world? And let me even just push this a little bit further. How does God work through evil? If the purposes of God are to bring about redemption, to bring about justice, to bring about understanding, equality, love, acceptance, to bring about God's kingdom here on earth, then how is God doing that? How does God work through the world? And so let's just jump into the deepest end possible. Let's just go into the ocean. How does God work through evil? Well, let me make about 5 statements here. Number 1, human agents freely decide to act in an evil manner and are allowed by God to carry out their evil intentions. We often think of them, whomever performs evil, as totally separate from us until we realize that there's a very, very thin line between people who don't do evil and people who do. Now, this is saying here that humans, we can decide to act in evil manners. And God allows us to. God doesn't control people. God doesn't say, David, you're about to do this. You cannot do this. God gives freedom. So is this upholding the strong view here? Well, no. We're really trying to unpack this middle doctrine of providence. So human agents are free to decide to act in either good and or evil manners and are allowed by God to carry out their intentions. Now, those who do act in evil, because that's where we're just kind of talking about the hardest thing here, the evil intentions can be expressed in a variety of ways, all of which are generally satisfactory to the human agents involved. I don't know why some people perform the evil acts that they do. I don't understand why people do many of the things that they do when it comes to evil intentions. A good friend of mine, the best man in my wedding, is a prosecutor in Dallas County. And it's fascinating hearing the stories of the things that he prosecutes, the people that he prosecutes. And it's sad recognizing that some of the things that these people do are profoundly evil. And they are generally satisfactory to the humans that perform that evil. So let's keep going. God intervenes, though, at crucial points to steer the expression of evil acts in ways that can be woven into a wider network of events and actions that fit God's good purposes for the world. Some of you guys might not know what this is that I'm going to talk about, but I was a senior in high school when the first kind of big school shooting happened in the United States, and it was a shooting at Columbine High School. It was my senior year of high school. I was a few miles away, and our school, we were locked down in the school for about 7 hours. I remember going home that evening after, probably 6 or 7 p.m. And I remember, and again, I was 18. I remember how some people would say, well, God caused this to bring about good. And again, let me go back. That's the strong doctrine of providence, that God caused that the two shooters didn't have any responsibility. And again, that's not what we're saying here. We're saying that God doesn't cause evil, but God intervenes at crucial points to steer the expression of evil acts in ways that can be woven into the larger fabric of God's good purposes. So, does God cause people to drink and drive, which results oftentimes in an accident or the death of somebody? No, God doesn't cause that. Can God somehow, through God's mystery or mysterious ways, work through evil to bring about good? Yeah. Can God work through evil? And again, try to get your mind around that. Can God work through evil to bring about God's good redemptive purposes? That's what we're saying here on this point. The next thing here, throughout all of evil, God acts only to bring about good. Okay, is God the cause of evil in the Episcopal tradition? No, not at all. Does God work through evil to bring about good? Absolutely. And that's really what we're talking about here in the most difficult discussion on a doctrine of providence. That God does work in and through created order to bring about good. God works through the good. That God works through the best, the brightest, the most caring people in the world. And God also works through evil. God also works through those people who bring about profound evil and brokenness in our world. And so what we're really interested in here in a doctrine of providence is this middle way that God cooperates with God's creation to bring about the purposes towards which God is working. God, for most Christians, it does not cause, control everything. God does not cause or control nothing. But rather we are concerned about this middle way in which God works in and through creation, in and through the good and also in and through the evil, to weave those events into God's greater purposes. Again, if you want to ask your question, where is God in many of the events of this world? I think one of the most compelling answers is that God is on the side of the suffering. That God is suffering with those people as God is working through creation to bring about God's created order. So many times people ask God, God, why did you do this? Or why did you allow this to happen? In my own life, whenever I pray and ask those questions, I often hear that same question in response. David, why did you do this? Or why did you allow this to happen? And it's because I believe that God is working in and through creation, that I believe that I have responsibility to work in and through creation to bring about the good towards which God is working. Because notice, in the middle doctrine of providence, I have free will. I can freely choose to work apart or work with God in bringing about God's purposes, or I can choose to just not care and to not participate in God's redemptive purposes. One last final note here. This is Jesus in the Gospels talked more about the kingdom of God than anything else. And so when Christians pray the Lord's Prayer and they say, "Thy kingdom come on earth," one of the things I think that means is they are praying, teach me to be a part of your redemptive purposes. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Let me be a part of your kingdom activity, of your working here on the earth now, in my local communities, in my family, in my school, in my work. Let me be a part of your providential work. So again, a doctrine of providence is the idea that God can and does work in and through the created order. The strong doctrine holds that that God controls basically everything. God knows everything. The weak is basically that God controls nothing, that God doesn't know much. And what we are really concerned about is this middle doctrine of providence, that God works in and through creation to bring about God's purposes by partnering with humanity, by being open to the successes and failures of working with human agents. And that is what we mean by a doctrine of providence.